Hello, my name is Shelley Bridgman. I'm a psychotherapist and a clinical associate with Pink Therapy. I'm here today with Dominic Davies, the founder of Pink Therapy and psychotherapist, and Pamela Gawler-Wright, who is also a psychotherapist and a clinical associate with Pink Therapy. LGBT, or lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender, has been a terminology in use since probably the end of the 80s, early 90s, as a collective description of what would be called the LGBT community. Today we're looking at widening this scope to include gender and sexual minority and gender and sexual diversity. And it's a really important point I think we've arrived at in the development of gender and sexuality issues. So Dominic, why are we moving away from lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender LGBT?
Well, I think the LGBT, and it became LGBTIQQA, so it added intersex, queer, questioning and their allies. And that was still very limited. It still excluded a lot of other groups. It excluded people who might be asexual, members of the BDSM and kink community, people who are in non-traditional relationships and who may be polyamorous or swingers, a whole batch of people who didn't feel able to go to mainstream counselling organisations and yet also wouldn't be necessarily welcome at LGBT counselling organisations. So I think Pink Therapy wanted to expand its remit on that.
And it's an interesting microcosm of what's happening in the wider culture as well. And the whole kind of process of giving words to things and saying this exists, we acknowledge this to be true, your experience as somebody who's bisexual rather than lesbian or gay, for example, that you're allowed to be that. We give you a name. And the same with things like intersex, which I only recently learned how commonly people have an intersex feature to who they are. And one of the things I think that is very interesting is how now we're allowing more of a spectrum, that people need wider language, people need better language to have that conversation.
Absolutely, and also that LGBTs have all got protected identities under the Equalities Act. But if you're kinky and your relationship gets into distress, or if you're asexual and heterosexual and your relationship is in some trouble, you might not feel comfortable going to mainstream counselling organisations, and you probably wouldn't feel comfortable or be welcome going into an LGBT one. And so the level of discrimination and alienation and isolation that those groups are feeling means that we're actually getting quite a lot of people presenting to us for therapy.
So Pam, can you explain the difference between gender and sexual minorities and gender and sexual diversity?
Yes, it's an interesting debate that I think is one that we don't necessarily need to solve or come to a fixed answer to. But gender and sexual minorities is favoured when, when people are talking about the experience of the individual, that for them, having something that has been outside of the norm is a key part of talking about what that is like for them, the truth of that for them. And some people feel it's very important to keep that sense of gender and sexual minorities. The gender and sexual diversities is actually at a higher logical category, because we're not necessarily speaking about individuals or individual experience. We're talking about culture, and we're talking about frames to think collectively and inclusively about differentiations which previously needed to be divided, to be known, to actually be acknowledged to exist. So I think that at that level of I exist in my difference is important to retain in terms of minority, and we exist at this time in a different way of thinking collectively and inclusively, and which also means that when a new diversity is expressed, it doesn't need to suddenly find another name for us to be embracing.
It can all be included within.
So Dominic, why now?
Well, for years I've been trying to, in the training courses, say to students, we're not talking about LGBT, we're also talking about GSM. And I've been using GSM and kind of really pioneering that, the acceptance of those terms as being much more inclusive. And the students would say to me at the end of the course, well, I get what you're saying and why you're saying GSM, but really, it isn't, they're not all minorities, are they? Because some of these, if you put all of these different minorities together, all of these minority identities, then actually we end up with a much bigger group, and heterosexuals, monogamous heterosexuals, become the minority themselves. So I was trying to find a new term, and then I thought, well, let's go for diversities and start trying to explain that. But I think you're right. If you're a lesbian or you're bisexual, you might well feel there are specific issues that are relevant to you as a minority within these GSD identities, and we can't assume that all of the things that apply to everyone are the same. You know, each category has its own unique characteristics. But there are some overarching similarities, I think, between them.
Definitely. And I think that there are some overarching principles that we can begin to share as people that allow us to have better lives living together and also living differently. And I listen to, for example, my nieces and people of a generation younger who are rebelling against all labels. And then I am the not labelled, and not labelled becomes a label. Right. And also, for example, with the advent of queer theory, when we're merely speaking about that which is not the assumed norm. And then how do we actually carry an identity that says, I wish to be free of being identified and labelled and fixed? And I think that paradox is something that is very much the postmodern age. And I think it's very expressive of the culture that's now emerging, having lived through the freedoms and with the ways of expressing ourselves and knowing ourselves that we fought for. Actually, when you're given that, you take that further.
So Pam, as you know, transgender people have been very ambivalent about being included in LGBT. Do you think this approach addresses this in some way?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that we have to accept is that there is a desire to address that question. Whether changing the language actually does that, we'll wait and see. However, a lot of transsexual people and transgender people have said they don't like being the T at the end, or you're the I at the end if you're intersex, or you're the Q at the end if you're queer. And so this listing has a kind of innate hierarchy in it. The other thing is that, as Dominic said, we're more of us together. And although there are different kinds of challenges that people of difference experience, some of those are themes that are collective, and we can get a stronger vocabulary together and a stronger way of living together if we work together.
I think one of those themes is the hypervigilance to being pathologised. I think one of the things that all of these different minority identities have in common is the sense that they're likely to feel that they're going to be judged as mad, bad or dangerous to know. And so whether that's transgender people, or whether that's bisexuals, or whether that's kinky people or asexuals, they're all going to have this kind of hypervigilance to being seen as being unacceptable by mainstream society, and that affects the way in which they feel comfortable living their lives. It often affects the way in which they feel comfortable living their lives. Many people aren't bothered by how other people see them, but I think it's kind of going on in our heads when we're introducing ourselves to people, when we're walking down the street, when we're wanting to express affection, when someone says, what did you do at the weekend? How much do we really reveal about who we are and what we did and about our lives?
Both for explaining it so eloquently. Perhaps a final word from each of you, Pam?
Yeah, a lot of people say to me, why this attention to labels? Do they matter? Are they useful, or are they in some way confining? And I think it is, again, a kind of double bind, is that we need to name ourselves in order to say we exist. But then once the label has taken hold, that kind of puts a static container over our identity and who we are. So I think language will constantly evolve around this. I think this is exciting, and I think we're creating a linguistic space for thinking to grow in. And it's great to be a part of that at Pink Therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency to say, well, I don't want to see anybody as different. I treat all my clients the same, and in doing so, I think that denies the very real differences that exist between them. And so, by trying to homogenise us all into, oh, well, we're all human beings, aren't we? Well, yes, we are all human beings, but some people have much more privilege and much more rights, or more wealth, or more status, or whatever in society than others. And so to deny any of those unique differences denies the agency and the integrity of the person that you're working with. So I think the labels do matter, but it would be nice if one day we could just all be accepting ourselves and each other for who we are, with all of those differences being valued and celebrated.
I think that's a great place to finish. Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Dominic. I hope this has clarified why we are moving towards a greater inclusivity and embracing diversity more. If you'd like to know more about the work of Pink Therapy and what's on offer, please visit the website www.pinktherapy.com. Thank you.